Welcome to Werezilla's Retrospective. I'm your host, Werezilla, and today I'm taking a second look at the first King Kong remake from 1976. I make good decisions. Sometimes. King Kong is important to me because seeing both the original 1933 film and the 2005 Peter Jackson remake was what really kickstarted my love of movies. Unfortunately, this made me something of a King Kong snob, as I was not a fan of the remake from 1976. I hated it when I saw it in 2005, and when I decided to review it 6 years later, a lot of those lingering feelings remained. It was one of several videos that I feel don't hold up, so if there's anything I'm going to take a second look at, it makes sense to start here. One of the big issues with my original review was the fact that I didn't like it. However, many of my dearest viewers do enjoy the film. At the time I was disappointed, but these days I've learned to appreciate people having different opinions, because that way I know they're thinking for themselves and are not just sheep. I'd also like to think that my approach to reviews has also changed. When I started, I was aping the Channel Awesome style of summarizing the movie while getting cartoonishly angry at the stupid parts and leaving the actual criticism for the last few minutes. In other words, it's something I'm not proud of. I changed the channel a long time ago, and now I'd like to think I can give this movie a fair chance this time around. Which is good because even without my previous experience with this movie taken into account, the 1976 King Kong does have quite a few things holding it back from being as epic as its predecessor or successors. It was made during a time when a protracted legal battle over the rights to Kong was happening. Universal and Paramount both wanted to make a King Kong remake, which got them in trouble with RKO, the studio that made the original film. Obviously, Universal's remake didn't happen, at least not in the 70s. And then there were the budgetary problems on top of this, as the filmmakers wanted to ambitiously use a full-size 40-foot robot of Kong for most of the movie. Sure, Jaws also had technical problems with its mechanical shark, but that film became a success. The producers certainly had Jaws in mind when making this movie, hoping it would be just as successful. Ain't that typical of a movie producer to be chasing box office success? They have high expectations even if they don't necessarily have the money to put it on screen. Let us begin.
Who the hell do you think went through there? Some guy in an ape suit?
Funny story about that, which we will cover later. First things first, this movie has the same basic story as the original film. An expedition to an uncharted island sees the crew coming across Kong, who carries off the one and only woman on the expedition. Eventually, Kong is captured, brought to New York, goes on a rampage, climbs the tallest building in the city, and is shot down. The familiar story, making the film's tagline an odd choice indeed.
The most exciting original motion picture event of all time.
Yes, the most exciting and original motion picture event of all time is a remake. What do words mean? Where it differs is in execution. In the 1933 film, the expedition was led by filmmaker Carl Denham, a daring adventurer who wanted to show the world something they had never seen before, despite the danger to himself and the venture crew. In fact, adventurous would be a great way to describe the original film. The sets and miniatures for Skull Island are beautiful works of art that look downright prehistoric. And this is before you take the actual dinosaurs into the equation. Which brings us to the 1976 remake, which takes a very different approach. It's a story about corporate greed. In Denham's place is oil tycoon Fred Wilson, a man who is motivated purely by profit. He sails to Skull Island in search of oil, having bribed government officials to get the details on the island's location, and assumes Jack is a spy from a rival oil company. Oh yeah, Jack in this movie is an anthropologist who stowed away on board the ship so he could study Skull Island's wildlife. It's telling that when a team is assembled to chase after Kong, Denham was leading the charge in the original film, while Wilson stays behind on the beach, telling his men to prioritize setting depth charges over their intended rescue mission. When his geologist tells him that the oil on the island is unusable for his purposes, Wilson intends to capture Kong so he can become a mascot for his company. The fate of the natives after Kong is captured wasn't addressed in the original film and saved for the sequel, Son of Kong. Here in this movie, it's acknowledged that taking Kong off Skull Island is effectively ending the culture of the natives forever. Give it a year and they'll all be burned out drunks, Jack says. These are things about Wilson that I heavily criticized in my original review, largely because I was looking at it through the lens of him being Denham's counterpart. However, there's one thing I hadn't taken into account. Unlike Denham, Wilson is this film's antagonist, which makes it all the more satisfying when Kong steps on him. This change is one of several that makes the 1976 film a far more cynical movie than the 1933 version. It's also a sleazier movie. While it's kinda sus that the original movie has Denham pick Anne up off the street and convince her to be in his movie, it's tame compared to what happens here. Since the Petrox Explorer isn't transporting a filmmaker and his crew, there's no reason for Anne's counterpart to be on the ship when it leaves port. Instead, she discovered adrift at sea in a life raft. Of course, instead of being named Anne, her name in this film is...
D-W-A-N, Dwan. That's my name. You know, like Dawn, except I switched 2 letters.
Yeah, she's a huge airhead. She says she was on a yacht that sank, leaving her the only survivor. Her explanation is that she was on deck while the others were below watching a movie during a storm. A storm that killed a bunch of scumbags, as it's implied they were trying to con her into being in a porno based on the film she was avoiding watching.
Did you ever meet anyone before whose life was saved by Deep Throat?
Naturally, we get a montage of her pining for Jack, contrasted with moments of the ship's crew being lecherous. This was Jessica Lange's film debut, and I'm sorry to say she and Jeff Bridges don't have much chemistry. The music has to do a lot of heavy lifting to get across the impression these two are supposed to be growing closer, because both actors constantly seem awkward around each other. Dwan's flirting is weird, while Jack sounds uncomfortable talking to her. Maybe it's because Dwan is characterized as a mix of a small child and a dumb blonde stereotype. There are rumors that the two actors had an affair during filming which are not true, and I can't imagine how they started given their on-screen interactions. Oh, I think it's hilarious that Dwan is the one who has a scene where she looks completely stoned and not Jack, for reasons that I shouldn't have to explain. If you feel like I do need to explain...
Yeah, well, you know, that's just like, your opinion, man.
And then there's Dwan's shared screen time with Kong, which heightens up the sexual aspect to the 10th degree. The waterfall scene feels like the world's most awkward shampoo commercial, while the silly grin on Kong's face as he tries to undress Dwan will haunt your nightmares. It doesn't help that Dwan tries to talk to Kong as if he will understand her.
Sometimes I get too physical. It's a sign of insecurity, you know, like when you knock down trees.
Seriously, this feels like it belongs in a King Kong parody. Is that what I'm watching here? Have I been wrong all along? Here's hoping Kong doesn't start flipping people the bird. Yeah, that scene comes from a Kongsploitation film called Ape. It has an alternate title, Attack of the Giant Horny Gorilla. Based on what we've seen so far, that should have been the alternate title for this movie. I think it's time we focus on the 8th wonder of the world. Remember that life-size Kong animatronic? Well, it didn't work. It ended up being a stiff and lifeless machine that was not useful for filming. The life-size arm that picks up Jessica Lange works like previous arms in other Kong movies, but the full-size robot not so much. Naturally, it ended up being largely unused, save for a few brief moments. By my count, it only appears in 8 shots. For most of the movie, he's portrayed by...
some guy in an ape suit?
Yeah, Jeff Bridges was right without even knowing it. This is the 3rd time Kong was portrayed by a man in a suit, and this is probably the best looking suit of them all. It was made by Rick Baker of American Werewolf in London fame, who also wore the suit on set, meaning he contributed a lot more than the credits suggest. Speaking of getting the short end of the stick, Kong's roars aren't a mix of animals like previous films as well as future ones. Instead, it's provided by a familiar voice actor, Peter Cullen. Yeah, before he was a truck, he was a monkey. In an uncredited role, and to add insult to injury, apparently he hurt his throat doing Kong's roars to the point he started to cough up blood.
What did they do to me?
The masks used for Kong are very expressive, contributing to the film's attempts to make Kong a sympathetic character. He always has been to a certain extent, but this film is the first time Okay, it's the first time in an American film that has human characters who are sympathetic to him in universe. I say attempts because the whole yeah, that gets in the way. Kong is without a doubt the best special effect in the film. All that money went into the robot that didn't work, causing the rest of the effects to suffer. The optical effects haven't aged well, and the sets for Skull Island, both the ones the actors interact on and the miniature sets for Kong, look cheap. The log scene is nowhere near as thrilling this time around, as Kong has to slowly rotate a thin log that causes clumsy sailors to topple over of their own accord. And then there's the biggest impact caused by the budget issues: the lack of prehistoric life on Skull Island. No Stegosaurus, no swamp-dwelling Brachiosaur, no meat-eater, or Plesiosaur, or Pteranodon. The latter three are rolled into one encounter when Kong fights a giant snake in his lair. A very stiff snake that is barely doing anything. The editing in this scene is choppy, probably to hide the bad special effect. I don't even know how to classify the bit where its jaws get torn apart. When Kong's brought to New York, the miniature sets are a little bit better, and of course the subway attack reminds me of the ride at Universal Studios. The one that no longer exists. What does exist is a TV edit of this movie that includes some new footage. Minor things like a few wide shots of the snake battle and Kong smashing a vehicle.
Well, they finally did it. They killed my fucking car.
Which just leaves us with the last scene of the movie, where Kong climbs the tallest building in New York. In 1933, that was the Empire State Building. In 1976, it was the Twin Towers. This is a hard scene to watch if we're being honest. Obviously, there's the tragic fate of the towers and all the people we lost on 9/11. It's also hard to watch visually. The compositing is at its worst in this scene, and the helicopters leave Kong a bloody mess. I suppose if there was ever a time to feel sympathy for Kong, it would be here. Shit, this is almost as gruesome as Kong's Skull Island. Kong walked away from his fight with Godzilla with fewer injuries. What an ending. And what a trip it was to get here, because the pacing of this film is slow. The cynical take on the story leaves the trip to the island dull with a very normal-looking ship. And while the locations for Skull Island are pretty, the lack of dinosaurs make it look far too modern, too normal. The 2005 film often gets criticized for being too long, and there's some truth to that, but at least stuff happened in the extra scenes. It adds flavor. This movie could have used some because the ship traveling and people walking feel more like padding. Things don't really get going until Kong first appears, which is halfway through the movie. I kinda get why. The expedition is motivated by greed instead of adventure, so the movie goes for a grimier, closer to reality feel. It's an interesting reimagining, but I don't like the impact it has on the pacing. Now I'm confused. What are my thoughts on this movie? Do I still dislike it? I mean, it's not great. There are things holding it back. But at the same time, there are nuances that I didn't notice the first time around. Let me put it this way. The producers of this movie wanted to dethrone Jaws at the box office. It didn't succeed, and Jaws is a better movie. That being said, the 1976 King Kong has had a much bigger impact on my life. It also turns out that there's plenty of people who enjoy this movie a lot more than I do. There are better Kong movies, and there are worse ones. All of this is a success in its own way. And now we're going to play a little game. Jeff Bridges and Peter Cullen were together in this film. Years later, Jeff Bridges and John Goodman were together in The Big Lebowski. And finally, John Goodman and Peter Cullen were together in... Yeah, that's right. Next time, we're talking about Transformers: The Last Knight. I'm looking forward to it, and I hope you are as well.
No, wait, don't tell me. I bet you're an Aries, aren't you? Of course you are, I just knew it.
Bo Derek was offered this role during casting. I think I understand why. I think I also understand why she turned it down.